Hello and welcome back, the DST Chat View. Tonight we have two great guests. The first one is Dan Canon. He is a civil attorney and professor. Jules, years of involvement in so many different things, and we will learn a lot from Jules tonight. Both of them you will be learning so much from. Before I welcome, I do want to let the audience know you are allowed to ask questions. If you go to the right, you can put it in the chat box. If you have any questions, that'll be just fine. Understanding, again, there will be no bullying. And if there is bullying, you will be removed from this chat. We're ready. Let's welcome our two guests. Before we start, I want to let you know who I am. I am wearing dark black glasses, dirty blonde hair. Dan, you can go.
Oh, thank you. I lost your audio for a minute. So I am Dan Canon, and I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I am wearing glasses. I'm a bald guy, and I've got a pale blue wrinkly shirt on, and I'm in my law office, I'm in my university office, and I've got some boring law books behind me, as well as my book, which is not boring, and some pictures of my kids and my wife, and some other stuff behind me.
Thank you. Jules, thank you. I am a white person with dark glasses, wearing a black shirt, black necklace. I have dirty blonde hair, and my background, there's a gray wall with some art, brighter than John's office. Thank you. I am going to go ahead and start with Dan Cannon. I'm going to be asking you 7 questions. If you don't mind just, summarizing who you are, where you're from, what are you involved with, just very briefly, if you would.
Sure. I am a civil rights lawyer. I have been in practice for about 15 years now, and I live in Southern Indiana, and I teach law at the University of Louisville Law School. And I have been involved mostly in what we would call civil rights cases since I started practicing. So that is a lot of employment discrimination, sometimes on behalf of people who have been fired because of their race or their sex or a disability. And I've also done a lot of constitutional litigations, so cases involving police officers or jails. And in 2015, I was involved in a case called Obergefell, and that's Obergefell. Sorry, I almost had it. Versus Hodges. And so that is the marriage equality case that brought marriage equality for same-sex couples to all 50 states. So that's a little bit about me, and yeah, that's about it.
Thank you. And you, Jules, do you mind kind of briefly explaining about yourself? Sure. I have been actively involved in many things for 30 years, from HIV, AIDS activist to now doing the reproductive equality that includes abortion, activism. I don't sign this sign for abortion because it can be triggering. So therefore, I will fingerspell abortion. Also, I work in mental health therapy where in Louisville. So changing in many different hats. Great. For the audience, sorry about that. For the audience, I want to make sure that you guys, everybody understands that we do not sign this for abortion. That's being thrown away. We will be finger spelling the word clearly. Okay. Ready for your 7 questions? Most of them will be for Dan, but Jules can also be involved if she if wants to share anything. First question. Can you briefly describe your belief and also the possibility of the future of abortion rights in the U.S.? Brief. Okay, so we need to do Dan.
Asking again. I'm sorry. It,
Sure. Can you summarize what the brief says and
oh,
the possibility of the future of abortion rights in the U.S.?
yes, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I think the opinion, the draft opinion that we have from Justice Alito, is basically represents the end of Roe versus Wade in the United States. And what it means is that states, if they want to, can criminalize abortion, and many of them do want to, and more than half, in fact, have laws in place that they are ready to go once this opinion is official and Roe is overturned. Then essentially abortion is going to be outlawed in about half the country. And the opinion is not entirely unexpected. I think. I mean, I think that that lawyers and law professors and the reproductive justice community has been expecting this or something like it. What's remarkable about this opinion is that it has very strong language and completely tosses out the entire framework of abortion rights and abortion access that we've been used to for the last 50 years. So it is a big deal.
Thank you. Do you have any comments to Dan? Me? I would say that with that brief, that the what it was really catches my attracts my attention. The conference is Amendment 14. Amendment 14 is that if we approach this, it can also impact others' decisions And that will be discussed further in this.
Yeah.
Thank you. Number 2. What does it mean when people say they will not ban abortion, only save abortions, and how does this specifically affect the groups of the communities, like same as the deaf community, the lower income, people of color? That is the first one. And then the second one, what would the country look like with, what you had said, with half of the states having the right and the other half not? Dan?
Yeah. We can see basically what, sort of a preview of what America is going to look like if we, just look at the example of Ireland. There are lots of places, in fact, that can serve as an example, places that have criminalized abortion or have very heavy restrictions on abortion. And what happens in those countries, and I think what will happen here, is that you'll basically have a class system where people that are able to afford it are going to go get abortion care from wherever they can go get it, and the people that can't afford it will either have a baby that they're going to have virtually no support and be unable to take care of. Um, because the unique situation in the United States, as all of you know, is that we really provide no child care services, no maternity care, no health care for mothers, no maternity leave, and the kinds of things that you have in the rest of the developed world. So I think the situation here will be quite dire for poor people. Um, but for if you can afford it, you'll have to go to another state and seek reproductive health care there. So you'll have a two-tiered system of people who can access abortion care. Um, and beyond that, I think that you're looking at a situation that is really a nightmare for marginalized communities overall, because of the factors that I mentioned, because of the lack of a social safety net in the United States. And if you have a situation, for example, where someone their life is threatened, and what is going to happen if you have a woman whose life is threatened by a pregnancy, and she has the means to go to some other state where they're not going to ask her 100 different questions and submit her case to a committee and do all the sort of star chamber type things that they will ultimately do in the states that restrict abortions, then she can go ahead and get that care. A woman whose life is threatened, that is of a marginalized community that can't afford to go 5 states away, may well just die, for not being able to, and especially since what we're talking about now, I think, is a post Roe versus Wade world in many states, where there will be no exceptions for the life of the mother. There will be no exceptions for rape or incest. So I think that for it looks like we are teetering on the brink of, not just the end of abortion access in America, but a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe.
Jules, do you have any comments? Yes, I would like to use this as an example. Recently, it was reported to me, and I just felt the person has trauma, sex assault, um, pregnant, lives in Texas. Unfortunately, she is deaf and afraid that if she goes to the clinic, there's where they tell, and you can't have an interpreter to come in, and reserve an interpreter because the interpreter may not keep their confidentiality. So had to go to another state. But the problem with that state, there was a long wait, just so many, booked clinic. So it was a 2 week longer wait and without an interpreter because that state is not great at providing interpreting services. So, you know, and just when she explained all that, and that's what it could, look at if Roe is overthrown. I cannot imagine, the USA right here, and then this is blue, and then the East blue, and in the middle, and the rest is fully red in the middle, the Midwest, like Jules was saying, needing to go to a blue state or going, to having to travel, like Dan said, to 5 states, or having the money to have the transportation to get there and they feel trapped. It's very unfair for the wealthy who can afford it. And then the people who are of lower income cannot. It's just very uneven. Is that correct?
Yeah, and a lot of that is already happening now because you see states that have had very restrictive laws about abortion access on the books for a long time. So if a woman has to, drive from a rural part of a state 4 hours to a metropolitan area, because that's the only place to get an abortion in the entire state, and then has to wait in that metropolitan area for 4 hours from her home. She has to wait 48 hours from the time of her initial consultation. Maybe she'll have to do an ultrasound. Maybe she'll have to, comply with whatever ridiculous requirements that the legislature has set up for what is and always has been a very safe medical procedure. A lot of these barriers to access are already in place and have been a huge problem for a long time. And now you're looking at those problems potentially getting a whole lot worse.
Yes. Next question. Section of the commandment, the Constitution that decides the Roe versus Wade is about the right to privacy. Can you explain any concerns for other civil rights, like the Obergefell versus Hodges case, and also the slippery slope, meaning, you know, it can, other things can be thrown out as well and
You know,
overturned. Um, can this, Dan?
so I think what's really important for your viewers to understand is that this opinion is important because it marks the first time that I'm aware of that the court has ever taken away an individual constitutional right. And when Trump got into office and started appointing new Supreme Court justices, I was one of the people who said, don't worry, everybody, because nobody ever gets their rights taken away. I don't think that's ever happened in American history, and it rarely happens in world history. And I was wrong about that. And, that's part of why this opinion is so shocking, is because it is just a full revocation of something that has been recognized as a constitutional right for 50 years. And so what that signals, we don't know ultimately what repercussions the opinion is going to have in terms of other rights. It's hard to say, but I think what the opinion signals, and what this move by the court signals, is that they are willing to take rights away, and that's a big deal. They're doing it in other ways too. Just recently, there was a case on what kind of damages you can get in a disability case, right? So, and that's and I believe it was under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the court says you can't get emotional distress damages. Well, you've always been able to do that in almost every court, in the country up until this point. And now for them to all of a sudden say you can't do that. Well, that is closing off access to the courts. So that is this court has signaled very clearly that it's willing to turn back time, that it's willing to take rights away from people to further an ideological agenda. And I think people should be alarmed by that. So in terms of what does this mean for Obergefell, I read the opinion as posing a clear threat to Obergefell, especially when you combine it with what you've heard from politicians in red states about Obergefell for the last couple of years. And, for example, in Texas, you have an attorney general that's saying, well, we don't have to go by what the Supreme Court says because we have our own law here in Texas. And if the courts, up until this point in American history, really, and certainly in since the middle of the 20th century, we've been able to rely on the courts to stop theocrats and fascists and all kinds of terrible people that are in control in the states. We've been able to stop them through the courts. And we can't do that anymore. We can no longer depend on the courts. So I think that should be very clear at this point. And so what does that mean? It means that we have to start looking for new strategies for activism and new ways to make change and to protect ourselves and to protect our rights.
Jules, I have a question for Dan. You had talked about protecting ourselves and having a strategy, and what does that envision look like?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm sorry to say, I am an American lawyer, and I was trained at American law schools, and as a result, I'm sort of necessarily an establishment guy. And we learn how to make change a certain way. And I think the sort of romantic notion of the American lawyer that goes in and files a lawsuit and fixes everything and saves the day is no longer a reality. And it hasn't been for a while, to be fair. It hasn't been really true in America for a couple of decades, but we still have that notion. And we like to rely on our governing institutions, our courts, Congress, the president, the executive branch, whatever. We know that sometimes they do bad things, but we like to rely on them to protect, our basic civil liberties, and to think that, all right, well, most of the time this is going to work out okay. We're starting to see I think very clearly that that is simply not true. That those institutions are not out for our best interests and perhaps never were. I'm also coming at this from a place of my own privilege, where I'm, a cis, white, straight, guy with no disabilities, and you know, I um, I think that for lawyers, it is incumbent on us to change. Like, we have to change our strategies. We have to change the way that we think about making change. And one of the big things that we have to do is to um, work hand in hand with marginalized communities and really listen to what people have to say and what people need on the ground, and try to meet those needs um, from the bottom up, and try to assist those communities from the bottom up, rather than trying to make change from the top down. But where we are in terms of lawyers and how they are trained is, we think of things as being top down. We think of change as being top down. We have to change that.
Thank you. Before I go to the next question, I do want to let the audience know that I have seen many questions that are coming up. Could you please hold off until we're finished with all 7 questions, and then we can show the questions, if that would be all right, audience? Thank you. Thanks for your patience. Next question, which is, I think, is interesting. During the not senator, Senate decision, the Alito Kavanaugh, Coney Barrett, and also Gorsuch, all are Roe versus Wade. It was already there. It was precedent. The quote settled law, I think. And then it was redetermined with the Casey versus Planned Parenthood. And that was when, if Roe versus Wade was overturned, and then that would come next. Can you explain more about this and how it connects to the abortion opinion signed on by, the Supreme Court?
Yeah. So here you have a situation where you've got a court again that is willing to throw away precedent, fairly recent precedent. Casey versus Planned Parenthood is from the 1990s, and so that's fairly recent case law. And I think that it says a lot about the court. So if you're asking about confirmation hearings, those confirmation hearings are nonsense. They're pure political theater. They don't mean anything. And I mean, you can
Just
tell
talk, talk,
exactly.
talk,
Yeah,
talk.
you can tell that. Now it's senators listening to the sounds of their own voice, and potential justices giving non-answers. That's what that is. So every justice that has ever been nominated in the last 20 or 30 years is going to sit there and say, well, I'll uphold precedent. I'll uphold precedent. Stare decisis. This principle that the prior opinions matter, and that's an important principle in the law, and we have to pay very careful attention to that. And wouldn't you know it, once they get into power, all that it can be cast to the wind. And we've seen signs of this, throughout the Roberts Court, throughout the tenure of the Roberts Court, and it just continues to get worse. Recently there was, I think in the last 2 years, there was this opinion called Janus on that's Janus that is about public sector labor unions. And in that case, the court said they can't require membership fees from people who benefit from the labor union's work, even though that had been confirmed over and over again in fairly recent Supreme Court opinions. Now, that's not as big of a deal in the public eye as Roe versus Wade, but it's still, you see the signs of a court that is willing to trample on precedent and throw things away to advance a very particular ideological agenda. Now, I don't think that it's a good idea necessarily for courts to just adhere to tradition, and keep doing wrong things just because that's the way we've always done them. But this really is turning back the clock to this sort of idealized past that never existed. And Alito's opinion is not really so much, going back to the golden days of the Constitution or anything like that, but it's just this pure fantasy land that conservatives have created for themselves about what a world free of abortions looks like, or in fact, what the Constitution is.
Jules, can you hear me? Dan, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
Okay.
now. Yeah, sorry, I lost you for a second, I think.
What Dan had mentioned about the Supreme Court, and going back over the Constitution, in the past, I just have a text, and I thought it would be a perfect question for Dan. Can you explain about explain the originist constitution? It might be spelled wrong. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Originalism. So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
The person is asking me, so I thought maybe it would be a good opportunity to learn what that means.
Oh, okay. So the idea of constitutional originalism is this sort of, to my way of thinking, silly idea that the Constitution, the principles in the Constitution, can't grow and change with American society. They basically stay the way they were in 1868 or whatever, right? 1787, depending on when the provision was. And so this idea of the 14th Amendment, for example, if the 14th Amendment, if the framers of the 14th Amendment didn't mean a certain thing when they put the 14th Amendment into effect, well, then it can't mean that thing. The 14th Amendment can't apply to that thing today. So the best example of that I can use is, let's use interracial marriage, okay? A marriage between a black person and a white person, for example. And that was criminal in some parts of the South, including in the state of Virginia, until 1967. And in 1967, the court issued an opinion called Loving versus Virginia. And they said that under the 14th Amendment, which was drafted and went into effect in 1868, this is in 1967, the court says, you can't criminalize, you can't make it a crime for black people and white people to be married. So an originalist might say, well, if you look at the debates over the 14th Amendment, the proponents, the people who wanted the 14th Amendment to be part of the Constitution, all said, no, we don't mean interracial marriage. Like, that's not what we're talking about here. We just think that everybody should be protected equally. And, black people can't marry white people, and white people can't marry black people. And so it's equal. And that's the way that the framers thought about the 14th Amendment. You can see very clear evidence of that. They certainly didn't think of the 14th Amendment as providing a right to same-sex marriages, that a man can marry a man or a woman can marry a woman. So an originalist is going to say, well, if they weren't thinking of that at that time, if that's not what the framers of the 14th Amendment meant, well, then it can't be what the Constitution means now. So it's to my way of thinking, it's a very silly way of thinking about constitutional law, because a lot has changed. This is just my opinion. I'm not a historian, but a lot has changed since 1868 and since 1787, right? Well, I can say why that's pertinent to this conversation too, if you want. I don't want to take up too much space here, but the reason that this is important here is because the draft opinion says that the Constitution makes no mention of abortion. Well, the Constitution makes no mention of a lot of things. And so if our standard is going to be the Constitution makes no mention of this thing, well, then, interracial marriage is off the table, right? Why not just take that away? The Constitution makes no mention of marriage. The Constitution makes no mention of women. The Constitution leaves out a lot. And so it's our job to interpret that over the years. And so the opposite of the originalist view of the Constitution is this idea of a living Constitution that grows and changes with society.
So just going backwards, and that also includes, deaf and hearing marriages, they wouldn't be able to be married anymore, you know, back then, you know, I forgot what the name of it was called, but there was like they weren't allowed to have like disability children who had disabilities weren't allowed to have access to education, and that affects everything as well.
Sure, and there is a move now. It's interesting you mentioned education, because there's an old case. There's a case from the 1980s. I say old. There's a case from the 1980s called Plea, that basically extends education rights to immigrant children, to undocumented immigrant children that are in the United States. So that public education is important enough that, we're going to extend those rights. Of course, the Constitution doesn't say anything about the rights of immigrant children to an education, or education more broadly. But yet, there it is in a Supreme Court opinion from the 1980s. And there is a serious push right now to get rid of that, to overturn that opinion.
We have about 20 minutes left, so I would like
Time
to
flies.
move on. Yes, I know. So, so that means we're enjoying our conversation. Do you have any thoughts on the leak itself? This has never happened at the Supreme Court. level. Most of the Republican Party and their leaders are really focusing on this, and they're really not worrying about the Roe versus Wade. They're really focusing on the leak. Um, just I feel like they're not caring about the people. Is it the big story and the focus on the leak and not praising the questions at the end of not doing the abortion rights?
Well, I think that it's a red herring for the Republican Party. The Republicans are sort of in a mode of constant attack, and they've figured out that their messaging strategy is going to be to go on the offensive about something all the time. They're never on the defensive, ever. And that's their messaging strategy, and it's worked very well for them. So attack on some other point that doesn't really matter, that is a diversion, that, is silly, but attack, right? Where I think I'm most disappointed about the non-story of the leak. And by the way, I have no idea. There's a lot of theories about where the leak could have come from, whether it was a liberal or a conservative or a clerk or one of the justices themselves. Who knows? I don't think it matters a whole lot. I think we'll probably find out. But I am a little disappointed in the Academy and in court watchers who are really taking the leak issue a whole lot more serious. They're taking the bait, and they're taking the leak issue a whole lot more seriously than the obviously very serious underlying issues of individual rights that are at stake here. And I think it speaks to just how much we train lawyers to value form over function in our law schools. It's a failing of legal education. But by the time they get to the second year of law school, they care a lot more about whether or not there's a process that looks fair in place and the integrity of that process than they do about real outcomes and real world outcomes and whether or not someone is going to suffer as the result of an opinion.
Jules? No? Well said. Great. Next question. Do you think this decision will have an impact on this midterm this November?
It could. I don't know. And I think it will have some sort of impact, but it's impossible to say what that impact might be. And you've got a charged up Democratic base, of course, because of the death of abortion access. But I think you'll also have a charged up Republican base because they feel like they've won this hard fought victory and they're going to win some more. And there's already now this giant anti-choice apparatus that has been built. And they're not going to stop. They're not going to go away just because Roe versus Wade is gone. There's a lot of money tied up in the anti-choice lobby. There's, and there are all these volunteers and all these, nonprofit organizations that are out there doing anti-abortion work. And they're going to continue to do that work even if no state allows abortion anymore. And, I heard an interview with the National Right to Life president on my way to this interview tonight. And what she said was, well, we don't really, we're not really targeting IUDs and other birth control devices, but we don't like them. And so, what do you think the next frontier is going to be? And it's already being experimented with in places like Missouri, and there are certainly grassroots anti-choice activists that are talking about, doing away with certain forms of, if not all forms of, birth control. So this doesn't stop, and the GOP is going to continue to find issues to whip up its base on, whether those issues have any anchor in any real social problems or in reality at all. So I don't necessarily think that this is going to cause a blue wave that is just going to knock the Republicans right out of the water. But my bigger concern is that now you've got the courts packed with judges who have seen that they can pretty much do whatever they want, and they're not going to be bound by the rule of law or rules of common sense. And so, even if the Democrats win in a landslide, what stops those judges from taking the election away? So I think that's most likely the direction that we are headed in here. I wouldn't expect this to be just a landslide victory for the Democrats in November. In other words.
Okay, Jules. Yes, I have already quote. I'm deaf, but keep my ears on the ground, and people are already talking about what their possible goal is when Roe is overthrown. The lesbians, gays, um, the IVF, yeah, infertility. And there's a concern about how much of that will be in the clinics and stuff, and so are going to be focusing on that, and the IUDs, just all of those things so far, and it's very scary. Last question before the audience can ask some questions. Where does the abortion right community, Democrats, go from here? Activism, you know, civil rights, and legislation.
I think that's a better question for Jules. I've sort of answered it in my own way, and I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we've got to um, seek out different strategies than other than what we are accustomed to, and we have to think about making change in new ways, because the courts are obviously not going to be any help, and I don't think that the solution is simply to go out and vote. I think it's going to require quite a bit more effort than that.
What Dan means is that, with that being said, we get, from the bottom, that's where we got to do. We provides and the advocacy starting from the bottom and the grassroots, and focus on developing a plan, B, C, D to Z, of how to provide accommodations in many ways, or abortions in many ways, including, and when, states, when Roe is overthrown, and then there's already a law, if a state already has like an automatic where it's once it's overthrown, and then it's immediately where, it's objected and it's not. So there we'll have to go to another plan and send, go to another state. And we need to develop a plan about transportation, finances, education about medical abortion, ordering it online, just finding organizations, you know, there's always a plan B. Like here we have like three or four where you can go pick up the plan B in their restaurants, and they still have those, and you can go get the plan B there. And I can go on with that, but you kind of get the idea what we're doing for right now. And also keep in mind that it's not impacting women only; it's impacting the the immigrants, the non-documented immigrants. The When someone finds themselves pregnant and they find that it's a red state, will they feel comfortable to reach out to unknown people to ask for help outside of state? That's a big question mark. That's just one, what I'm keeping my eye on in this issue. I am ready for audience questions, but first, I want to show the audience Dan Canon's book. Let me show you. Could you briefly just explain what your book is all about?
Well, sure. It's about the American criminal justice system through the lens of plea bargaining. And basically, what I do is I talk about a lot of problems within criminal justice and trace all those problems back to plea bargaining, which is a thing that we do in the United States way more than in any other country. And what I wanted to do is to sort of see if, I mean, I knew that we did a lot more plea bargaining, and that's how we handled a lot of our cases. Is that a lot of our cases end in guilty pleas? 97% end in guilty pleas right now, and that's way higher than the rest of the world. And also, our criminal justice outcomes are so much worse than most of the rest of the world. We lock up more people. We have more people under state control. We lock up people for longer. We arrest more people. And so I wanted to see if those two things were connected. And the other thing that I really wanted to explore in the book, and which is helpful for our conversation today, is how do you change public opinion about criminal justice issues, right? And so how do you activate people to make real change within the criminal justice system, especially when it looks like you're not going to get help from legislatures and you're not going to get help from courts? And I think this is really, it may not seem like there's a lot of overlap between the criminal justice issues that are in the book or that are covered by the book and what we've been talking about today and what's been in the news for the last couple of days. But I think what we're about to see is this massive collision of abortion issues with criminal justice issues, because you're going to see untold numbers of doctors and women getting locked up nationwide and having to navigate criminal justice responses to that problem. So it's going to become very important for activists to know how to respond and to know how to reform and to know how to, I think, ultimately disrupt the American criminal justice system. And that's what I talk about in the book.
Thank you. I have already put a link up above if anybody is interested in buying Dan's book. It's all there. It's a good book. And I am ready there's lots of questions. So hopefully they'll pop up and you can answer them.
Boring, 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 boring.
We need a new constitution that allows everyone the right to vote, not in this one that originally only allowed wealthy white landowners voting rights. Dan?
I mean, I agree. The question is, what happens if we hold a constitutional convention now? This is the thing that conservatives are pressing for, and they really want it. And I do not think that a constitutional convention right now, as opposed to 100 years ago, or every step of the way like we should have been doing it, would be a particular. I don't think it would be a particularly great outcome at this point in American history. But I do think that the commenter is right that it is sort of foolish for us to hold on to this 250-year-old document and pretend like everything today is as it was back then.
How many states do not require parental consent abortion?
I don't know. I'm just a lawyer. I
I should know, but I can't think. I think half of them.
I don't know.
I do, and I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But of what I recall is most of the red states and a few of the other states have the parental consent. In that case, some states allow teenagers or minors underage. If you don't want to get your parents' consent, then you can go to the judge, front of the judge, and it's really not easy to do that. And some, judges in some states are like, and some of them just, thank you. There are few companies who will be willing to help with staying, traveling, etc., in order for women to go to states that are legalized to abort.
Wait, I think okay. Yeah.
Yes, they are called AP, Abson Abortion. Oh, abortion financial or abortion finances, and then there's also reproductive organizations that are nonprofit, grassroots groups. Understanding now they will help with transportation. They may help with a hotel stay if you have to stay there overnight. Some states require 24 to, maybe 72 hours between, appointments. Some may require you to fly, you know, it's, because they're over 20 weeks, so they have to go to a specialist that is allowed, and they're the states that allow it, and it's very expensive. So we do have groups that help us out with that, yes. But what's challenging right now is the money. Because once Roe is overthrown, then we will need more monies to help pay for the transportation, paying for the medical, paying for the hotel, paying for this, 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 this.
I've lost your audio again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I've got you now.
Okay, I don't know.
No, I don't have an answer anyway, but
Dan Canon, thank you for joining us at the DST Views, and also the interpreter was able to do the signing and the talking part of it. Thank you. So before they leave, Jules will maybe staying, and we're going to go ahead and discuss and have a chat because we do want to explain, what to do if someone, does get pregnant and what they can do, and just giving some more advice. So again, thank you, Dan Cannon.
thank
Thank
you
you.
all so much for having me. It was an honor.
Good night.
The U.S. Capitol Dome, a symbol of America's history of freedom and democracy, is one of the most recognizable structures in the world. Constructed of cast iron and completed during the Civil War, the dome is now 150 years old and has not had a full restoration in its history. The last exterior restoration occurred in the 1960s, more than 50 years ago. Without the proper maintenance and repair, the exterior of the dome continues to slowly deteriorate as it ages, and is exposed to the effects of weather. Moisture-generated rust is entering the surface, creating hundreds of cracks and causing deterioration of the structure and its ornamentation. Weathering and cracking of the existing iron exterior allows water to penetrate the dome's outer shell and migrate into the rotunda interior. The water and moisture threaten not only the artwork housed below, but also the iconic apotheosis of
George Washington, members of Congress, their staff, and the millions of people who annually visit the U.S. Capitol.